In a neighborhood on the creek lived and labored a man with limited means, with barely enough to secure. He owned a small piece of land and a smith shop, enough to provide a living for his family, but he little expected to be anything more than the village blacksmith. But when oil fever broke out, the hole in his backyard set the wheel of fortune spinning in his favor. This is the story of a pretty coquette from Franklin who captured the nation's attention when in 1860 her father struck oil about 10 miles away from Oil Creek in Franklin. The headlines gave her father credit for drilling the second well after Drake, but it's more likely it was the second oil well drilled in Franklin, just 1 week behind the well put down by Franklin Mining and Oil Company. Nationwide songs were written about the beautiful young lady and her beau, and their story made it all the way to London, when a shopkeeper in 1875 once asked a local furniture salesman, who was on a buying trip abroad, if the story about the young couple and the celebrated Evans well was true. Welcome to Liberty Street. Today we are walking into the past, into oil history, and strolling down to 12th Street, and then to the corner of Otter and into the Evans family home on the banks of French Creek, where we will meet their oldest daughter, Anna. Unfortunately, the original house isn't there anymore. It burned to the ground in 1927, while the aged Anna of 93 years wept at the loss of her family home and their rise to the top of the derrick, and her fall with a lifetime of papers and mementos. Total loss. The sleepy little city she called home in 1859 was an up-and-coming cosmopolitan city where judges, lawyers, and congressmen were born. However, just a few villages away, somewhere below the New York state line, there lived farmers whose life was similar to that of Rip Van Winkle. They lived on an English settlement where the locals told tales of their strange superstitions. They owned the finest farms in the area and were the best of citizens. They were simple and honest. They were emigrants from Devonshire, Lancaster, Cornwall, and Yorkshire, and they belonged to a class from England who brought with them folklore and their own cures for healing. Reportedly, they used jewelry and coins among animal hides and witch hazel sticks to heal the sick. And I know this because their story was reprinted in the December 1885 newspaper from Jackson, Tennessee, having first appeared in the Chicago Herald. Now, this type of behavior would be unlikely in the new pristine town of Franklin. There was a pretty public square in the center of town, and it was lined with elm trees. The townsmen of about 900 were settled and had a respectable air about them. They looked rather disdainfully on the likes of the sorts who lived up at Cornplanter and those beyond on the cricks. After all, the daughters of the town merchants attended the Institute for Young Ladies at Canonsburg and were finely dressed in taffeta and lace from Jimmy Lamberton's store. Anna was just 2 when her father, James Evans, moved to town to take on a smithy job and set up his shop. Bought 2 lots along French Creek and near a spring that was made famous by a man named Marcus Hullings, who ferried folks across the creek in a canoe to collect the fresh and good-tasting spring water. Of course, since it was western Pennsylvania, the oil clung to all parts of the water, and Marcus also skimmed a quart or 2 of the black oil each summer to use for liniment and medicine. The well-known raftsman ferried many people on the creek and also on the Allegheny River to and fro Pittsburgh, but eventually he lost his life to the creek in the early 1800s. The news of his drowning rocked the village, as Marcus and his father were well known, and he was the first to be buried in Pioneer Cemetery. Now that Evans had purchased the property and set up his smithy shop, he dug a water well near the old walnut tree. But it smelled of oil and was such a smelly dark green that he abandoned it and used the spring water nearby. However, after the news of Drake's oil strike, he got the fever and he set about to try it again. And this time he was actually looking for the oil. As Hildegard Dolson reports in her book, The Great Oil Dorado, once he struck oil at 17 feet, the news of his good fortune spread quickly and the town went crazy. It was just after 10 a.m. on the cold November morning when the local tanner, Andy Bauman, heard the shouts. He was in the back alley about to dip a hide when he saw a crowd running by. Reverend Eaton of the Presbyterian Church saw Andy running, so he rang the church bell wildly to sound the alarm. Children came running out of the one-room schoolhouse near the church, followed by Mr. Dale, their teacher, and a pack of barking dogs. Dr. Robinson rushed to the scene in his stockings, so startled that he forgot to put his shoes on, and women ran from their housework without fixing or covering their hair. Apparently, the dark green oil came in all by itself without a pump, and it appeared to be gravity-fed. Since it was dark and thick and free of dirt, it soon became known as Franklin Heavy Oil. It appears to have been a magical time for the sleepy, quiet town. By all accounts, the charms of oil fever from the oil creek near Titusville took its hold on the local townsmen. According to the historian John McLaurin, the townsfolk were enchanted with the news, so much so that court was adjourned by Judge John McCalmont, and a young lawyer ran off to see the wonder. The young man ran to the Evans home and called on Anna, and she greeted him at the door yelling, "Dad struck oil." The expression caught on, and of course, like any good game of telephone, the story grew bigger and better each time it was told. The story was picked up by newsmen all over the country and abroad, but not so much about the oil strike, but instead for the alleged behavior of his eldest daughter. To say she was canceled, that's an understatement. Every newspaper in the nation, which was the social media of its time, was going for her. Whether or not the story was true, it was repeated and reprinted over and over again, chastising the young lady for putting on airs because her father had just struck oil. Now, before the oil strike, Evan's first daughter, Anna, had blossomed into maiden as a beautiful, blonde, blue-eyed girl. She had plenty of suitors who wished to court her, but most of them were timid and could not get past her beauty to work up the courage to speak. That summer, one local attorney had mustered up the strength, and he had escorted her home from church a time or two. So when the news of the strike hit, it's alleged that he rushed to the Evans home to see her, and she rushed to him yelling, "Dad struck oil." All of this according to our local newspaper and historians. Now, depending on which version of the story you believe, because there are two, she also had another suitor, and he was of little means, who also stopped by a time or two. Allegedly, now that she was an oil princess, he donned his best suit one Saturday night and made his way to her home to congratulate her. If you believe the national newspapers, she turned upon him with a look of lofty independence that would have done honor to a Broadway belle, and she replied in severe language and said, "Nonsense! You can't come here for that. My dad struck oil." We may never know which story is true, but the poor girl went down in history as having rejected the young man and putting on airs because of her father's good fortune. From what I understand, Anna explained it was a joke, but a few neighbors insisted that it wasn't. To the local townspeople, and perhaps a catty girl or two, the story was repeated as true. I can only imagine Anna's strife when the story circled around again in the papers in 1894 and dredged up the drama once again. Now, I can say with certainty that the newspapers, they took some liberty with the story the second time because they changed her name to Susie Evans. They changed her father's name to Franklin Evans. And they actually named the poor boy and said that he died alone, never having loved or been married. Now, all the while this was going on and during the excitement, a man named Frederick Prentice arrived in town from Toledo, Ohio. He offered James $40,000 for the well and the lot, but he rejected it. So Prentice moved on to Cooperstown and found his financial success out there. Apparently, another man arrived in town and offered Evans $500,000, and he turned that down. Old man Evans, he should have taken the money, and he held out as long as he could, but the well started to go dry and the price sank so low that he leased the well to an oil company from Philadelphia. After he died, the engine was taken away, the rig was knocked down, and the hole was filled with dirt. His will was filed at the Venango County Courthouse, and in 1876 he left 1/3 of the homestead, horses, and tools to his daughter Anna Evans. His other daughters were mentioned with their married names, so I can only assume that she was still unmarried upon his death. It had been 16 years since that fateful event, and it must have taken a toll on the young lady. Who knows? Either the story was true and she continued to reject many, or all the potential suitors stopped coming around once the likes of the story was printed about her. We'll never know, but if it wasn't true, what a burden she had to carry. And perhaps that is why she later married a newcomer to town. By 1880, she was living above 13th Street on Elk with her new husband, Miles Smith. Smith was born in December 1826 in County Durham, England. He arrived in America in 1840, and he made his way to Franklin in 1864, just 4 years after the Evans well. He operated a furniture business on 13th Street and was a member of St. John's Church. And it was the likes of this Englishman to mend the heart of our aging coquette, who by then was 46 years old and well past motherhood. Per Dolson, as reported in her book, Dad Struck Oil made its way all the way to England. While Smith was on a buying trip, a stranger learned of where he lived and asked him if the story about Anna was true. Perhaps he had his eye on the girl, or they were already courting, for some time after this and before 1880, they were married. 20 years later, they were living in the James Evans family home, and he was liquidating his furniture store and going out of business. It was later sold by auction in 1899. Smith died in 1909, and Anna went on alone again until 1928, when she died of pneumonia, just a few months after the house fire that destroyed the family homestead. And it was almost 67 years to the day that her father struck oil.